restrictions were supposed to slow China down. They didn't. In fact, while Washington spent much of last year tightening export controls on advanced semiconductors, one of America's most important chip executives quietly boarded a plane to Beijing. Then he did it again. Not once, twice. That's the detail that caught my attention. Because when the CEO of a company sitting near the center of the AI revolution flies across the Pacific during the most intense technology confrontation in decades, he's probably not going there for sightseeing. And when he keeps returning, it usually means the conversation isn't finished. The easy version of this story is that American companies want access to Chinese customers. That's true. It's also incomplete. The more interesting question is why some of the people closest to the semiconductor industry seem increasingly worried about a future their own government is trying to build. And that takes us into a much bigger conflict than chips. We're watching a collision between national security and economic reality. For years, policymakers in Washington believed they could maintain a technological lead by restricting China's access to advanced equipment, advanced AI chips, and the tools needed to manufacture them. The logic wasn't complicated. Modern economies run on semiconductors. Modern militaries do too. Control the chips, and you influence the future. There's a reasonable argument behind that. Many American officials genuinely believe China's technological rise presents strategic risks that cannot be ignored. They're not inventing those concerns out of thin air. But here's the tension. The semiconductor industry wasn't designed for geopolitical separation. It was designed for efficiency. A machine might contain components from the United States, software from California, manufacturing tools from the Netherlands, wafers from Taiwan, specialty chemicals from Japan, packaging in Southeast Asia, and customers everywhere, including China, especially China. By some estimates, China represents roughly 1/3 of global semiconductor demand. Not production, demand. Think about that for a moment. Imagine telling the automotive industry to permanently disconnect itself from 1/3 of the world's car buyers. Technically possible, financially painful. The CEO at the center of this story understands that better than almost anyone because he lives inside those numbers every quarter. And here's a fact that rarely makes headlines. Many chip companies don't just sell products to China. The revenue they generate there often helps fund the research that creates the next generation of products everywhere else. Cutting off access isn't simply removing sales. It's potentially reducing the cash available for future innovation. That doesn't automatically make the restrictions wrong. It does make the situation more complicated than political slogans suggest. The strange part is that while governments increasingly speak the language of economic separation, businesses continue behaving as if the global system remains interconnected. Because in many ways, it still is. Last year, while public attention focused on sanctions, export licenses, and AI competition, conversations were happening behind closed doors between executives and Chinese officials. Not secret meetings, not conspiracies, just something far more significant. Negotiations over how the world's most important industry is supposed to function when the two largest economies no longer trust each other. And the CEO's second trip is where this story becomes particularly interesting, because by that point, he wasn't just listening, he was carrying a message that revealed something many politicians still struggle to accept. The semiconductor race isn't simply about who can build the fastest chip. It's about who can survive the costs of breaking the system that created those chips in the first place. We'll come back to that second trip, because the agreement discussed there tells us far more about the future of American technology policy than most people realize. The most revealing part of those Beijing visits wasn't that they happened, it was what they suggested. Because if the world's two largest economies were truly preparing for a complete technological divorce, there wouldn't be much left to discuss. The rules would be the rules. Companies would adapt. Everyone would move on. That isn't what's happening. Instead, senior executives keep showing up in China, Chinese officials keep meeting them, and both sides continue searching for ways to preserve pieces of a system that neither side fully trusts anymore. That tells you something important. The semiconductor industry has become too interconnected to unwind cleanly. Consider the economics for a moment. Developing a modern AI chip isn't like launching a new smartphone. The costs are enormous. Research teams, software ecosystems, testing, fabrication partnerships, packaging technologies, customer support. The bill runs into billions before a product ever reaches the market. Those costs only make sense because companies can spread them across a massive global customer base. And China is not a small piece of that customer base. It's one of the largest technology markets on Earth. For years, American chipmakers benefited from selling into that market. The revenue wasn't simply profit sitting in a bank account. A significant portion of it was recycled back into research, engineering talent, and future product development. That creates an awkward reality. When policymakers restrict access to a market, they aren't just limiting sales. They're also reducing the financial fuel that helps fund the next generation of innovation. To be clear, that doesn't automatically make the restrictions a mistake. National security concerns are real. The concern in Washington is that advanced computing power could eventually strengthen military capabilities, surveillance systems, cyber operations, and AI development in ways that undermine American interests. That's a serious argument, but business leaders are looking at a different set of numbers. They're asking whether the restrictions are weakening China faster than they're weakening the companies expected to stay ahead. And those are not necessarily the same thing. This is where the conversation becomes more interesting than the headlines. Most reporting treats the situation as a contest between America and China. In practice, there are three players: Washington, Beijing, and the multinational corporations caught between them. The goals of those three groups overlap sometimes. They also collide. A government can tolerate short-term economic pain if it believes the strategic payoff is large enough. Public companies don't have that luxury. Every quarter arrives whether geopolitics cooperates or not. That difference in incentives explains why some executives have spent the last few years walking a very careful line. Support national security objectives, comply with regulations, maintain relationships with Chinese customers where legally possible, protect future revenue streams, keep investors happy. None of those objectives are easy to balance simultaneously. One dry observation: governments often talk about technology as if it were a chessboard. The people actually building the technology are usually staring at spreadsheets, and spreadsheets have a habit of exposing problems that speeches don't. By the time those meetings in Beijing were taking place, another concern had started emerging inside the industry. Not what China could buy, what China might build. Because restrictions create incentives. Every barrier creates pressure to find another route. If Chinese firms couldn't reliably access certain technologies, the logical response was obvious: develop domestic alternatives. That's exactly what Beijing had already been trying to do through initiatives backed by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, state investment funds, regional governments, and national champions across the semiconductor sector. The assumption in many Western discussions was that this process would take a very long time. Maybe it still will. But there was a risk hiding inside that assumption. If China eventually succeeds, American firms don't simply lose restricted sales. They could lose future market share as well. And once a customer builds an alternative supply chain, winning them back becomes much harder than keeping them in the first place. That's the possibility hanging over every one of these conversations. Not a sudden collapse, not an immediate victory for either side. Something slower. A gradual restructuring of the technology economy that could leave both countries with less influence than they expected, and a very different semiconductor industry than the one that existed just a few years ago. At this point, it's tempting to view the situation as a simple race. America restricts, China catches up. One side wins, the other side loses. Reality rarely gives us stories that clean. Because the semiconductor industry isn't a single technology. It's hundreds of technologies stacked on top of each other, each with its own bottlenecks, specialists, and supply chains. China has made meaningful progress in some areas. It remains dependent in others. Both statements can be true at the same time. Take manufacturing. For years, one of the strongest arguments behind export controls was that advanced chip production depended heavily on equipment China couldn't easily replace. The most famous example is the extreme ultraviolet lithography systems produced by the Dutch company ASML. These machines are among the most complex manufacturing tools ever built. Thousands of suppliers, components sourced from multiple countries, decades of accumulated expertise. The logic seems straightforward. If China couldn't obtain the most advanced equipment, it would struggle to manufacture the most advanced chips. Reasonable. Except something unexpected happened. Chinese companies didn't stop trying. They adapted. In 2023 and 2024, the appearance of advanced processors manufactured by Chinese firms sparked intense debate across the semiconductor world. Analysts who had assumed progress would slow dramatically suddenly found themselves asking a different question. Not, can China advance, but how fast? That shift matters, because uncertainty is often more powerful than certainty. When policymakers believe an obstacle is permanent, they make one set of decisions. When they suspect the obstacle may only be temporary, the calculation changes. And this is where the story takes a turn. The biggest risk facing American chip companies may not be China's current capabilities. It may be the possibility that restrictions accelerate China's future capabilities. Notice that's a different argument. The goal of export controls was to preserve a technological lead. But if those controls convince Beijing that self-sufficiency is no longer optional, then enormous amounts of capital, talent, and political attention get directed towards solving the problem. China has already demonstrated this pattern before. High-speed rail, electric vehicles, solar panels. In each case, dependence on foreign technology eventually became a national priority. The results weren't immediate. They took years. Then suddenly, global competitors found themselves facing Chinese firms that had become far stronger than expected. That doesn't guarantee the same outcome in semiconductors. Chips are harder, much harder. Anyone claiming China's path will be easy is ignoring the engineering reality. But anyone claiming China cannot eventually close parts of the gap is making a different mistake. The evidence no longer supports that level of confidence. Which brings us back to those meetings. A lot of people assume executives fly to Beijing because they're worried about this quarter's sales. I'm sure sales matter, but the more interesting concern may be what the market looks like 5 or 10 years from now. If Chinese companies become capable substitutes across larger portions of the semiconductor ecosystem, the competitive landscape changes permanently. And once ecosystems mature, they develop momentum of their own. Customers build relationships, software gets optimized, engineers gain experience, supply chains form around new suppliers. The transition becomes harder to reverse. This is the reversal hidden beneath the entire story. Many people view export controls as a defensive strategy designed to protect American technological leadership. They may still do that, but they are also functioning as an industrial policy for China. Not intentionally, yet incentives don't care about intentions, they care about outcomes. My own view is that both sides are underestimating the costs of this transition. Washington may be underestimating how quickly necessity can drive innovation. Beijing may be underestimating how difficult it is to replicate decades of accumulated expertise. Both assumptions can fail simultaneously. And if they do, the semiconductor industry enters a period that looks less like globalization and more like duplication. 2 ecosystems, 2 technology stacks, 2 sets of standards, far more expensive than the world viewers have become accustomed to. Which raises a question that almost nobody was asking a few years ago. What if the most important battle in the chip war isn't about technology at all? What if it's about who can afford the bill? That may sound like a strange way to end a discussion about semiconductors. Who can afford the bill? But after looking at the numbers, the policy decisions, and the behavior of the people closest to the industry, I keep coming back to that question. Because technology leadership isn't a trophy you win once and place on a shelf. It's a recurring expense. You have to fund the research, train the engineers, build the factories, upgrade the equipment, then do it all over again before your competitors catch up. The semiconductor industry lives in a constant state of reinvention. Standing still is often enough to fall behind. That's why those trips to Beijing matter. Not because a CEO secretly changed the course of history during a meeting. Not because some dramatic agreement was signed behind closed doors. Their significance is simpler. They revealed that even at the highest levels of the industry, people are still trying to preserve connections that governments increasingly view with suspicion. That tension isn't going away. If anything, it's becoming the defining economic story of the next decade. The United States wants technological leadership. China wants technological independence. American corporations want access to both markets. Those objectives overlap just enough to keep the system functioning, and conflict just enough to ensure constant friction. The outcome will shape far more than the semiconductor sector. AI development, cloud computing, military capabilities, consumer electronics. The cost of technology that eventually lands in ordinary households. All of it is connected. And this is the part that often gets missed. When people hear chip war, they imagine something distant. Something happening in government offices, corporate boardrooms, or fabrication plants on the other side of the world. Yet every major restructuring of a supply chain eventually shows up somewhere familiar. Prices, jobs, investment decisions, economic growth. The bill always arrives somewhere. The only question is, who ends up paying most of it? There's also a possibility that neither side gets exactly what it wants. Washington may succeed in slowing certain areas of Chinese technological development without stopping them entirely. China may reduce dependence on foreign technology without achieving complete self-sufficiency. The future could be messier than either government's official narrative suggests. History tends to favor messy outcomes, especially when economics and geopolitics start pulling in opposite directions. My own prediction is that we're moving toward a partially divided technology world, rather than a fully separated one. The incentives are simply too strong. Companies will continue searching for legal ways to serve multiple markets. Governments will continue tightening controls around strategically sensitive technologies. Both trends can happen simultaneously. In fact, they already are. That's why I don't think those Beijing visits were an exception. I think they were a preview, a glimpse of how the next decade will work. Executives flying between rival powers, trying to keep commercial relationships alive, while politicians argue about national security. An uncomfortable balancing act. Expensive, complicated, probably unavoidable. And there's one final irony here. The effort to preserve American technological leadership may ultimately depend on something policymakers rarely celebrate: continued participation in the very global markets they're trying to reduce dependence on. The semiconductor industry spent 30 years building a worldwide system. Rebuilding it into separate pieces will take years, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and produce consequences nobody can fully calculate yet. Which makes those flights to Beijing look a little different. They weren't signs that the confrontation was ending. They were signs that even the people helping manage it understand how difficult separation really is. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and stick around. The biggest stories in technology usually aren't about the products. They're about the incentives hiding underneath them. And right now, those incentives are reshaping the world faster than most headlines can keep up with.